Hi, this is Digital Beersborn. I thought it'd be helpful to take a look at some sample questions for the AP exam that's coming up, and also just to talk about what to expect and how to go about taking the AP Art History exam. It's very different this year, obviously, because we're taking it from home, and they've really pared down the amount of information that you need to know and the amount of questions. Instead of having, I think, 80 multiple choice and 6 FRQs, it's now simply 2 FRQs, one long and one short. So let's talk about the details of that a little bit, and then we'll look at a couple examples of sample FRQ questions that College Board has provided us with. Now, the exam is going to be next Friday, May 15th. For us in Pacific time, it'll start at 9 a.m. This information is available to you too on the College Board website. But what you want to do is click on your e-ticket link 30 minutes before the start of your exam. Now, I assume that e-ticket is something that you probably already have, or if not, you'll get it soon. They recommend clicking on it 30 minutes before, just to make sure that everything is all set up before the exam time starts. Now, once the exam starts, the first exam question will appear automatically, and a timer will start counting down. The timer shows 30 minutes for the first FRQ question. Now, it recommends that you take 25 minutes to read the question and work on your response, and then leave 5 minutes to submit it. When the timer gets to 5 minutes, an alert will show up to let you know that this is the time when you should start submitting your response. Once that question is complete, a second FRQ will pop up. It's the shorter FRQ. It gives you 20 minutes, which is 15 minutes to read and write the response, and another 5 minutes to submit it. Now, on the exam day next Friday, you want to have your e-ticket email ready. You need to have some kind of computer. You can do it on your smartphone, but I think having a laptop or a desktop computer will make it a lot easier for typing. And I would also recommend having your notes, your flashcards, and any other resources if you have any study books or anything that you want to use as well, because all of that stuff is available for your use. Now, let's talk about the FRQs themselves. There are 2 FRQ questions. The first one is the long format. Now, we've taken a lot of long format FRQs in our unit tests. This one's going to be slightly different. They've adjusted it to compensate for the fact that you'll be taking it from home with your notes available. So it's going to be slightly different than the ones that we've taken as practice in our class, but in general, it'll have a lot of similarities. Now, the general idea for the long FRQ is that it gives you a work that we've studied before and some kind of theme. Now, if you've had a chance to look over the major themes worksheet that I gave out in the Google Classroom, the theme will fit most likely within one of those ideas. We'll take a look at the example here in a minute. And then your job is to pick another piece, either from the list provided or a different work if you'd rather, and compare and contrast the given piece with the work you've selected based on that theme. Now, we've done FRQs like that together in our unit tests. Now, the second FRQ, the shorter FRQ, what this one does is it gives you a work of art and it asks you specific questions about it. This year for this test, what College Board is going to do is ask you to write about a work of art in terms of explaining how it demonstrates continuity or change within an artistic tradition, meaning that it gives you a piece and asks you to say how this kind of fits within the larger timeline of art history. How does it represent kind of the established artistic traditions of that period? But then also, how does it break with the stuff from the previous periods? And we'll take a look at an example of that as well. So let's look. Let's start with the short FRQ, actually. I believe they're going to give you the long FRQ first, but let's start with the short FRQ and kind of go through the sample the College Board has given us and kind of analyze how to best approach your response. So this is the short FRQ. A lot of time, 15 minutes for writing plus 5 minutes to submit. And it gives you an image of a work of art that we've studied. It doesn't identify what that work is. You have to recognize it visually. So hopefully you have good notes and you've been able to study and review the stuff from our previous chapters. So at least you'll be able to recognize that in some degree, enough to place it within its larger history. Now, if you don't recognize the piece at all, you can go to our website. We have all the image sheets up. It might be a little time consuming to look through them all to find this work of art, but hopefully you'll be able to pinpoint at least enough that you can narrow it down to recognize like, oh, this must be medieval, or this must be Renaissance, or this must be 19th century, or whatever. For this work right here, I recognize this as a Baroque artist, Vermeer. And even if you weren't necessarily sure of that, you'd be able to say like, okay, well, it's very representational. It looks kind of, must be something from the Renaissance or afterwards. It's definitely not medieval. And you'd be able to kind of look through the image sheets and hopefully find like, oh, here it is right here. It's in Baroque. You could even pull up the flashcard for it. Now, hopefully you have your flashcards all finished, so you'll be able to have all this information on hand. What we're looking at here is a piece called Woman Holding a Balance by the artist Vermeer from the Baroque Northern European period. Now let's take a look at the directions. This is the writing prompt. Now it splits it up into 3 different sections. Now remember, for each different section, it's highly recommended to use a separate paragraph in your response. Make the answer very clear and organized so that the reader knows where all the information is. You don't need an introductory paragraph, you don't need a conclusion, you just need a well-organized paragraph to address each one of these prompts. So let's start with A. It says, using 2 examples of specific visual evidence, explain how this work demonstrates continuity with established artistic traditions. Now, I'm pretty confident that your FRQ will have a very similar wording, just a different work of art to talk about. What this is asking you is for specific visual evidence. That means things that you can see in the painting. It's not talking about context. It's not talking about patronage or historical events or function, but it's just talking about things that you can see visually in this work. And using that, explain how this demonstrates continuity with established artistic traditions. That's saying, how does this fit within the larger timeline of art history in that it represents the kind of established artistic practices of that period? Now, we know that this is a Baroque Northern European artist, so we can think about how does this period of the Baroque fit with the visual established artistic traditions of Europe at that moment. This is coming out of the Renaissance, right? What did the Renaissance do artistically that this continues to do? You could talk about representationalism. You could talk about the material, the use of oil paint on canvas. You could talk about the use of light and shadow to create this established 3-dimensional quality to the work. Anything that kind of fits this with the previous period of the Renaissance would be a good starting point for that first prompt. So you're going to pick out 2 things that you see visually in this work of art that kind of fit with what the Renaissance was doing that carries over into the Baroque. So that's the first paragraph. Second paragraph says, using 2 examples of specific visual evidence, again, explain how this work demonstrates change from earlier artistic traditions. So this is saying, what do you see visually here that is different than the established traditions of either the Renaissance or even the Baroque? How does this kind of break away from the established traditions of this period? You could talk about the Protestant Reformation in this case. If you remember, or if you refer to your flashcard, it talks about Protestant art and how this work is typical and atypical of Protestant art and Protestant artists. And you could use that as a starting point to talk about how is this different than what had come before it. And for this one, I might write about how a lot of Renaissance art and medieval art even before that was so entrenched in Catholicism, and so much was put into the communication of the Bible and the concepts of Christianity and these big dramatic pieces of Christ and Mary. And this piece does not necessarily have that quality, right? It's not overly dramatic, and it doesn't really focus, at least overtly, on Christ or Mary or figures from Catholicism. They're kind of relegated to this painting on the back wall very subtly, but instead it's a quiet moment of a woman at home, a genre painting, if you remember the terminology. So you could talk about how that breaks away with the established traditions of what it's depicting visually by kind of moving away from the super dramatic Catholic art of that period and previous into something different, into these kind of quiet genre paintings of Protestant art. That's the second paragraph. The third paragraph says, using 2 examples of specific contextual evidence, Explain why this work deviates from established artistic traditions. Contextual evidence is anything that comes from our context section. Historical events, religion, politics, the artist's identity, anything like that function even fits within contextual evidence. It's everything that's happening outside of what you can see visually. And using that contextual evidence, it's asking you to explain why this work deviates from the established artistic traditions. So why does this piece look different than other earlier Baroque pieces or Renaissance pieces or anything that's led up to this work? And you could talk about the Protestant Reformation in this case. I know the religious events that have led to the Protestant Reformation changing the way art looks, right? So I could use that as the basis for my response. It's asking for two examples, so I could maybe find two aspects of the Protestant Reformation that influenced this work. Or maybe I could talk about the original location of this painting. This was made in Northern Europe in places where the patronage of most of the art were rich merchants rather than the Catholic Church or rather than a king. And that celebration of wealth is represented through the woman weighing her jewelry, right? I know who the patron of this piece would be, and I could talk about how that changes the way the art looks as well. It's all that contextual information. So you have to know quite a bit about the work. Hopefully you'll be able to refer to your flashcard and to your notes or to any other resources that you have so that you'll be able to get to that level of knowledge quick enough to formulate your response and write it out. But I would imagine that the format of the prompt will be very similar to the example given here. 3 separate paragraphs asking for 2 visual examples of how they look the same as the established artistic traditions. The second paragraph is 2 examples of how it looks different than the earlier artistic traditions. And the third paragraph, 2 examples using contextual evidence, establishing why it's different. That is the short FRQ. Hopefully that helps. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, now let's take a look at the long FRQ. This is a 25-minute FRQ, and the way it's formatted is that it gives you an image of a piece, but it doesn't tell you what that piece is. It's up to you to recognize it again. In this case, the example that they've given us is this. It's a piece that we've looked at pretty recently. It's the Painted Elk Hide from the Indigenous Americas chapter by the artist Coetzee. Now, the piece that's given to us on our actual test could be anything from any of the chapters that we've covered within the given window. So it can't be anything from Asia or for Islam, but pretty much anything else we've covered it could be from. So hopefully you have a familiarity with the work so that you can recognize this and at least have the ability to find it easily to pull up your information. Now, we've done FRQs that are similar to this on the unit tests all year. This one is a little bit different, though. The ones that we've done have focused on identifying information, like you have to know the material, you have to know the artist or culture of origin, and so on. The FRQs that they're writing this year don't have that on the long FRQ. Because we're taking it at home, you can find that information easily, so that's no longer really part of the prompt. But instead, what it does is it frames the work around a specific theme. Now, if you've had the time to look at our worksheet about themes, let me pull it up right here. It gives you, I think 11 different common themes that are used in this FRQ. It's things like art that creates sacred spaces, art that's about power and authority, art that establishes wealth and status, art that deals with the natural world, the human body, the ideal, identity. One of them that commonly comes up is how art explores social, cultural, or political identity. Could be ritual religious objects, could be funerary traditions and death, could be narrative in art, could be innovations in art. These are the common themes. Now, every once in a while they throw a new theme in there, so it's not 100% going to be one of these themes, but most typically they are. And we'll notice that the example they've given us deals with identity. So this prompt that you're going to be given on the test, it starts with them just establishing what theme they're going to be talking about in this prompt. It says the painting conveys aspects of cultural identity. And then it gives you the directions. It says select another work of art that conveys aspects of cultural or national identity. You may select a work from the list below or any other relevant work from any geographic area or time period. Please clearly communicate which work you'll discuss in your comparison. So what this is asking you to do is to find another work of art and compare it to this piece. Now it gives you options. Down at the bottom of the prompt, in this case, we have two: Diego Rivera's Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park, or Jacob Lawrence's The Migration of the Negro, panel number 49. You can choose either one of the pieces from this list or a different piece that we've studied if you would prefer. Now, there's no extra points that you're going to get for choosing one that's not on the list. So don't feel like it's better to not choose the suggested examples. These are the ones that the College Board has identified as probably the best opportunities for comparison. So usually those are going to be your best option. It's going to be the easiest to write about one of the ones on the list rather than one of your own choosing off the list. But again, that option's up to you. If you have a piece that you really know a lot about that you think you could write in a relevant way comparing to the piece given based on that theme, then go for it. But anyway, it asks you to please clearly communicate which work you will discuss in your comparison. So your first line, your first paragraph of your FRQ is simply going to be you writing, for this piece, or I'm sorry, for this FRQ, I'll be writing about Diego Rivera, Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in the Alameda Park. Or I'll be writing about Jacob Lawrence's The Migration of the Negro, panel number 49. Just identify it so the reader of your FRQ knows exactly what piece you're talking about. And that's it. First part of the prompt done. The second part is where the analysis really starts. It says, explain one similarity in how the object you chose and the object shown convey aspects of cultural or national identity. Describe specific visual characteristics of both works to support your explanation. Now, one thing I would recommend here is you want to talk about everything you know that is relevant to what this question's asking. This is an opportunity for you to kind of show off your knowledge. So don't try to be as brief as you can, but instead use it as an opportunity to really kind of like illustrate your depth of understanding. What it's asking you is to identify a similarity in how this piece visually represents the culture of Coatzico and how, let's choose Diego Rivera, how Diego visually depicted the Mexican cultural identity in Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park. You're going to find a similarity. Now, for me, if I was writing this piece, I might talk about how in the Coatzico piece, he shows a couple different aspects of his cultural identity mixed together in one scene. There's the sun dance in the center, mixed in with a buffalo hunt, which are two big kind of cultural identifying aspects of his people, right? In Diego Rivera, he does the same thing, right? He shows a bunch of different historical events that are all part of Mexican heritage mixed together in one scene in Alameda Park. We have like Hernan Cortez, and we have all these different figures from different periods in time and different aspects of Mexican history side by side mixed together, right? It's kind of similar. It describes the cultural identity in this kind of mash of historical events and practices in one scene. It's similar. So I might write about that and really kind of try to illustrate my depth of knowledge of that topic. That is going to be your second paragraph. Now make sure you're talking about specific visual characteristics. The prompt that you're given, although it won't be about these pieces, is going to say the same thing. What they really want you to do is to identify what you're looking at in the piece that explains that. Like visually, what do you see in the piece that connects to what you're talking about? Third paragraph. It says, explain one difference in how the object you chose and the object shown convey aspects of cultural or national identity. And again, describe specific visual characteristics. So this is asking you to illustrate how the two pieces are different visually. How does Coatzico's representation of his culture visually look different than Diego Rivera's? For this piece, you could talk about, a comparison between abstraction and representationalism. Coatzico's work is very abstract, simplified shapes. There's no illusion of depth, right? Just like kind of big, simplified shapes and bright colors. And every figure just kind of exists floating in a blank void, whereas Diego Rivera has a sense of depth using perspective, and there's the human figures are much more representational. There's a sense of anatomy to their bodies. There's shadow and light and all that stuff. Those are visual examples that are comparing the two. Now, fourth paragraph, it says explain one similarity and how the object you chose and the object shown express the values of the society in which each work was created. Support your explanation with an example of relevant iconographic or contextual information from both your chosen work and the object shown. Now, iconographic just means symbols, use of symbols. Don't worry about that, because what we're focusing on is contextual information, context, which could be things like historical events. It could be religion or politics. It could be the artist's identity. It could be patronage. It could be function. Contextual information is anything that is beyond the way the painting looks visually. It's all the stuff that's happening around and behind the work, right? That's context. So what we're asked to do here is compare the two and find a similarity in the context of both Coetzee and, in this case, Diego Rivera. And just off the top of my head, I might write about both cultures were impacted by European powers coming over, right? We have the indigenous people of North America that were forced onto this reservation by European powers. And this piece is kind of about their cultural identity after that happened. It's them holding on to things like the Sundance after, Europeans have forced them into the reservations. And same thing with Diego Rivera. Dream of a Sunday Afternoon in Alameda Park really deals with the conflict between indigenous populations and Spanish conquistadors like Hernan Cortez, all right? So we have that kind of similar context between that conflict between indigenous and the European invaders. So you might write about that. And then the last fifth paragraph here says, explain one difference in how the object you chose and the object shown express the values of the society in which each work was created. Again, support your explanation with contextual information. So what's different about the context between the two? You might talk about patronage, perhaps. If you remember, this piece was painted largely to appeal to white tourists coming to the reservation, right, that would want a piece of this kind of indigenous cultural history. So the audience that this was intended for was not necessarily within the culture that created it, but more meant to appeal to the descendants of the white Europeans that originally put them in the reservations, right? Or in comparison, Diego Rivera, he's making a piece that is really meant to appeal to the Mexican identity after they've already won independence from Spain and kind of a celebration of their own cultural identity. So the intended audience for that is very different. It's meant to appeal to his own cultural population, whereas Coetzee's is maybe meant to appeal to an outside population. So the patronage is a difference in contextual information. So again, the specific information I'm talking about here, comparing Diego Rivera to Coetzee, is obviously not going to be the same for you come your AP exam next Friday, but the prompt will be pretty much the same. It'll start with a theme, a specific theme that most likely will be similar to one that we talk about on that themes worksheet in the Google Classroom. And then it'll ask you to identify another work, either from the list or not on the list, if you choose to. And then a paragraph talking about similarities visually based on that theme. A third paragraph talking about differences visually based on that theme. A fourth paragraph talking about similarities in context based on that theme. And finally, a fifth paragraph talking about differences in context based on that theme. Now, hopefully that helps. Again, my kind of just general tips are make sure your answer is organized, so have separate paragraphs for each part of the prompt, and use this as an opportunity to demonstrate your depth of knowledge. There's no specific length requirement, but you want to use it as a way of showing everything you know that is relevant to that answer. Assume that the reader doesn't know anything. So the more information you can give them that is specifically tied to what the question's asking you, the better you'll do. Now, if you have any questions on any of this, feel free to email me, rbeersborn@canaleusd.org, or you can leave comments in the Google Classroom, and I'll help out any way I can. Again, our AP test is going to be next Friday the 15th at 9 a.m., and the information on how to go about getting ready for that is on the College Board website, and you should be getting an email with an e-ticket that'll explain a lot of that too, I believe. Great. Thank you. Bye.